Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Ag Committee meeting this morning. I guess we'll have roll call.
Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Eklund is
Excused.
Representative Johnson.
Here.
Representative Ottman.
Here.
Representative Provenza.
Here.
Representative Schmidt.
Here.
Representative Strzok.
Here.
Representative Davis.
Here.
Chairman Winter.
Here.
Thank you.
Again, welcome this morning. As we begin the meeting, I'd like to call your attention to the committee rules of decorum. So copies of the decorum rules are located with hand copies of the agenda and are available for view on the legislature website. So, but the main thing is to, when you're testifying, is to address the chairman and to be sure your cell phone's turned down. So that's about the main thing. First bill on the docket this morning will be House or Senate File 120, and we have Senator Salazar here to explain the bill. Welcome, Senator Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, honorable members, I have with me Mr. Tyler Lindholm, who literally is the father of the Food Freedom Act, so I thought appropriate for him to come up. This this is a rather simple but actually quite good bill, in my opinion. So, members of the committee, I think Americans want to buy fresh meat from local farmers. Americans want to pay less for food, and Americans want to keep their dollars local. And I have before you the Wyoming Prime Act, which is a bill that would allow small-scale farmers and ranchers to sell homemade meat products. The bill would expand an exemption to the Federal Meat Inspection Act to allow meat from custom slaughterhouses to be sold to customers and retailers. So primarily, what the Prime Act specifically does is it allows, as I say, small farmers and ranchers to slaughter and process their livestock at local custom slaughterhouses, remove the federal ban on selling meat from custom slaughterhouses, and it allows states to pass their own laws to regulate the sale of custom slaughtered meat. Now, the Prime Act is a trigger bill. It only takes effect when Congress passes the federal Prime Act. But what it does is that it helps thousands of farmers support their families and bring fresh and local food to customers at a reasonable price. And to me, this is nothing more than common sense reform. If you take a look at the bill on page 3, there are some requirements, however, with regard to the Wyoming Prime Act. The meat products that are sold directly to the informed consumer must have a label, a written warning statement delivered that informs the end consumer at the time of sale that this was not inspected by USDA. On page 4, it clearly shows that it's a trigger bill. On line 15, the producer shall not publish any statement associated with the meat that implies or states the Wyoming Department of Ag has approved or endorsed the meat product. Once you purchase it, you cannot then resell it without letting that person know that, again, this is a product that was not inspected by USDA. Again, it's a fairly simple bill. This was actually brought to the state legislature last year. It overwhelmingly passed the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by the governor last year. And his letter was because he didn't believe in trigger bills. I happen to believe the governor was wrong. I'm hopeful that this year, and I think this bill passed out unanimously in the Senate, I am having discussions with the governor's office. In fact, I had some yesterday. I feel a little more confident that the governor will see that with skyrocketing food prices, this is an opportunity for us to actually lower food prices. I know that in my neck of the woods in Riverton, people on fixed incomes are really hurting purchasing food. It's just continuing to grow, skyrocket. And so here's some way, some small way that we can actually try and fight inflation, and do it where everyone benefits from it. So that, Mr. Chairman, is in summary what the Wyoming Prime Act does. If you would indulge me, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to give a minute or two to Mr. Lindholm, and maybe he could make some comments as the originator of the Food Freedom Act in Wyoming.
Yes, Mr. Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. What Senator Salazar has done with this legislation is fairly novel in the regards that it certainly does await approval of legislation from the federal level. But I wanted to talk on really quick why that's a requirement. Under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, there's 3 different types of slaughter that's allowed in the United States. There's USDA inspected facility, state inspected facility for states that have state primacy, Wyoming does, and then custom slaughter facilities. Only state inspected facility can you get processed at and retail within the state. USDA inspected facility you can get processed at and sell across state borders in the United States. But custom slaughter facilities, those are scattered across Wyoming. I am 100% certain they're in every one of your districts, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. They're not allowed to retail. In order to utilize a custom slaughter facility, you have to be the owner of the animal before it's slaughtered. So what we've got happening, or what's happening in the state of Wyoming, as I'm sure everyone in this room can attest to, is you buy a quarter or a half or something like that. And then you can utilize a custom slaughter facility. You take your portion of meat home. That's a great system, and it works for the large part of us. The biggest problem that we've got in this scenario, though, is a quarter or a half of beef is expensive. It's a lot of beef. So I paint the picture of the single mom raising babies. She probably doesn't have $2,000 to $4,000 where she can dump that on beef. Probably not even the freezer space to be able to store that much beef. Instead, that individual is trapped at shopping at one of our bigger box stores where they're paying insane prices right now. They're paying for the most expensive product that can be purchased in the state of Wyoming. While those of us that do have those connections to beef, we get a great discount because of those connections. So what this legislation would aim to do, if passed by the federal government, Wyoming's trigger bill would immediately enact and allow the Department of Agriculture to say custom slaughter facilities that were formerly only for the select few can now all of a sudden retail. And that's a fantastic opportunity in the state of Wyoming because that makes it so all of those little custom slaughter facilities that are across the state now have the option to be able to sell locally. Which, I mean, even my little town of Sundance has one of those, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We don't even have a stoplight. So this is a really good opportunity where we can lower the price of the best protein in the United States. We can lower that price by making those direct-to-consumer sales more available. I'll stand for any questions if you have them, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lindholm or Senator Salazar? Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, so I'm looking at the congressional prime, trying to figure out what the status is of that. What is the status? Where are we at? How far are we from potentially passing it? And how does that look different than what we have in front of us?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a super good question, Representative. The Federal Prime Act has not been refiled this Congress as of yet. Typically, that's filed by Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky. On the Senate side, it's filed by Senator Angus King from Maine. And And as of a good note, every one of our federal delegation at one time has signed on as a sponsor of that, as a co-sponsor of that legislation. The way it looks in the Federal Prime Act is it specifically goes into, I believe, the department will correct me if I'm wrong, it's section 627 of the Federal Meat Inspection Act that specifically lines out what a custom slaughter facility is. And to kind of give you an idea as far as what that looks like when that inspection happens, state and USDA inspected, has an inspector on scene all the time. Those individuals are there essentially to grade meat, is their fancy way about things. A custom slaughter facility, whereas it's only inspected maybe once a year, a couple of times a month, where someone from the state comes by and ensures health and cleanliness. So it's a different type of inspection, but those are the same individuals that inspect all of our restaurants. And the thought process is if it's good enough for restaurants, where restaurants are certainly not killing us across the state of Wyoming, it's probably fine for beef. But that's essentially what the Federal Prime Act looks like, is it's amending the section 627 of the Federal Meat Inspection Act to cite, if a state so chooses, they may opt into a custom slaughter facility direct sale.
Any follow-up? Okay. Anyone else have questions for our two presenters? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Appreciate
Chairman.
you being here. So do we have any state agencies here to come forward, please? Mr. Miyamoto.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Doug Miyamoto with the Department of Agriculture. And I would start by saying that I understand the premise behind the bill. Get it completely. The Department of Agriculture knows what the desire of the legislature and even we as a department would like to see happen when it comes to meat regulation of this source. That said, we have a contractual obligation to carry out to USDA. We have a contract with USDA to carry out the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act here in Wyoming. That's part of our agreement for primacy for the program. That's why we do it. We could accommodate this legislation as it's currently worded in that it's a trigger bill. And so as long as that happens at the federal level and the Prime Act passes federally, then we could implement the provisions of that act and carry that out here in Wyoming. But I think the impact to us as an agency would be different than that. And I think what would happen, and we've seen it before, is that if this legislation is passed, we think it would be an indication to certain citizens in that sector of meat processing and meat buying that it is now legal to purchase at retail custom exempt processed meat. And it wouldn't be unless and until that happens, the Prime Act is passed at the federal level. So that doesn't excuse anybody from the federal penalties that come along with selling at retail an uninspected meat product. That's my fear, is that, you know, we get publications that say, hey, the Wyoming Prime Act passed and that allows for custom exempt processed meat products to be sold at retail. I can envision a scenario where our citizens immediately begin offering custom exempt or at-home slaughtered and processed meat for sale. And if that happens, I don't want to be the villain that has to go out and regulate that activity and make sure that it stops. I would be obligated to do that in order to maintain our state primacy. It puts me in a difficult position. For those of you that were around during 2019, you remember when we passed hemp legislation. And that was immediately after hemp was allowed in the 2018 Farm Bill. But we had a time gap there where USDA was not delegating authority to states yet. USDA was not offering permits to grow hemp yet. And we had state statute that passed in 2019 that said Wyoming will seek primacy for the hemp program and regulate it within the state. We do that now, but we had people that immediately began growing hemp, and they were doing that when we didn't have the authority to issue a permit yet. And USDA was not issuing permits at the time. So we had some people that got caught in the middle, and I don't want to see that happen again. That's primarily why I bring that up, because we as a department have experienced that in the past where we had legislation pass. We also had some federal legislation pass, but they didn't have implementing regulations in place yet, and they were not accepting applications from states for primacy for that program. So we couldn't legally issue a permit, but yet our state statute said hemp is now legal to grow, and we had some folks get caught in the in-between. So my main point today is just to inform the committee that today, as it stands, without that federal Prime Act passing, anyone selling these meat products without that federal or court action would be subject to penalties and fines, and I think they're the ones that could be left holding the bag in this scenario. The other important factor, the last point that I'll make, is that if federal action, meaning the Prime Bill, passes at the federal level, or if court action determines that these sales are legal, custom exempt process sales are legal at retail, then we would immediately begin pursuing that and would not stop the sale of those products. Anyway, we incorporate the Federal Meat Inspection Act, a lot of provisions of it by reference. And so if that changes, then so does our enforcement at this level here in the state of Wyoming. So that's something where if the federal Prime Act passes, the department would immediately pursue allowance of the sale of those products as it lays out in the federal Prime Act. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Representative Banks.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director, so in my mind, I guess I see maybe somewhat of a solution here. When you send the inspectors out to these custom facilities, they can simply raise awareness that says, hey, this is just a trigger bill based upon the federal rules becoming law. Would that take care of some of that problem, just raising some awareness?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Banks, yes, that would be part of the strategy that we would do when we would go and reissue a commercial food license to each of those individual custom processors. We would put a cover letter in there that says, just so you understand, we don't want to get anybody sideways, but the effectiveness of doing the outreach and education portion, we try to do that with every action. And it never gets 100% penetration.
Thank you. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you give me a rough estimate of how many facilities we have in the state of Wyoming that we're contemplating here?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I think today we're looking at about 36 facilities that do custom exempt processing. Some of those also do state inspection and federal inspection as well. There's about 14 federal inspected facilities in Wyoming today. That's a big increase from when I came on board. And then we've got 6 or 7 state inspected facilities on top of that.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions? Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, what are the consequences if someone does violate the federal act and thinks they're following what state law is?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, from our end, the first thing that we would do is go have a conversation. We try to educate before we regulate, and we would try and cease and desist any further sales of those products. If that continues, about the only thing we have left to do is to suspend the license, which leaves us in kind of a scenario where it's all black or all white. There's not a lot of in-between intermediate steps that we can take to try to discourage the behavior. Like, we can tell you, you got to stop this and pull this product off of the shelves and quarantine it, get it under control and quit. But if that doesn't work, the only thing we can do at this local level would be to pull that license. Beyond that, we would have to have conversations with our federal counterparts that manage our contract for primacy and discuss further penalties beyond that.
Okay, well, thank you. I see no more questions, so
Thank you,
thank you very
Mr.
much for
Chairman.
being here. Are there any other agencies that would like to testify? Okay, if seeing none, we will open up public comment. So anybody interested in testifying, please come forward. Mr. Moline, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau, sitting in favor of this legislation. I can't say it any better than what the father of the Food Freedom Act and Senator Salazar said. So just a ditto those comments. I understand the Department of Ag's concerns, but I will say that Farm Bureau has a newsletter that goes out to about over 10,000 families, and we can dang sure get that word out that it is not legal now. You need to wait till we have federal action to help out the Department of Ag on getting the word out. And the one thing I really like about this trigger bill, that when this gets accomplished at the federal level, it'll immediately come into impact in Wyoming. We won't have to wait for several months for you folks to meet to do the act. We'll have it on the books, and we'll be ready to rock and roll and get it going. It'll be good for the producers, good for the consumers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I take any questions you or the committee may have.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Moline?
Thank you.
I have one. Mr. Moline, so I'm, based on your testimony, you'll be in touch with our Department of Agriculture and in case this happens. And so you can put an article out to all of your members. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, on both ends. We can tell them right now it's not legal yet, but then working with the Department of Ag, when it becomes legal, we can work together to get the word out and get this program up and rolling.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Any more public testimony? Mr. McGagna, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. We support this legislation as well. Particularly in the last 4 or 5 years since we had our COVID outbreak, and that consumer interest in buying locally, buying product from people they know and how they raise the product has really skyrocketed. And one of the frustrations has been that you have producers who are willing to sell directly to consumers, but the only way they could do it is selling a live animal or then having them processed and they have to buy a quarter of it or that. And so I think that people have been trying to see how they can get around this, and they can't legally and successfully get around it. Normally, we are hesitant to support legislation whose effectiveness is dependent on a federal action that hasn't been taken. But in this case, because there is some potential, I think passing this legislation here could help us, give us an additional tool that we can utilize to further seek the federal legislation. So for that reason, but with the understanding that it will have no meaning here until there's change in federal law, we're supportive of this legislation.
Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions for Mr. McGagna? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I'm just a consumer, but I pay attention to where stuff I buy comes from. I went out and bought a freezer specially so that I could buy things like a side of beef, and so I support the legislation.
Thank you very much. Any questions for our testifier? Thank you very much. Anyone else like to testify on this bill? Seeing none, I guess we have some, or do we? Do we have any Zoom participants?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Nancy McCann,
Welcome, ma'am.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
We can. Thank you. Come on, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. My name is Nancy McCann. I represent the Powder River Basin Resource Council. Our membership is up to over 1,500 members, and it includes ranchers, producers, and others. We're here to rise in support of Senate File 120, the Wyoming Prime Act. We also have a newsletter that we send out as well as alerts, so that we would commit to helping out to get that information out, so that way everybody can be informed within our area. Wyoming should be prepared, and so no sense in waiting for the federal government. At least we'd be able to have that trigger bill. So once it does get passed at the federal level, we'll be ready to roll. So thank you so much, and I stand for any questions.
Thank you very much for being here. Anybody have any questions for Ms. McCann? Okay, appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Are there any other, no more Zoom participants? So what is the pleasure of the committee?
Second.
Okay, the bill's been moved and seconded to, any, Representative Strzok moved it and Representative Banks seconded it. So Representative Davis.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, could we bring the author of the Freedom Act back up here? I have one question, just a scenario to ask.
Mr. Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As a producer, Mr. Chairman, as a producer, what would prohibit me taking a beef in, have it processed, and then through a USDA certified plant, and then retail that as an individual back to consumers?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Great question, Mr. Chairman, to Representative Davis's question. Nothing. That is absolutely the way it's supposed to work right now. As you know, one of the biggest issues is how many USDA facilities do you have in your community? It's kind of a tough deal in that regard, where we've got all of these custom slaughter facilities, but we can't retail directly to consumers because that butcher shop does not meet the qualifications deemed worthy enough by the federal government.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just clearing that up in my little brain.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr.
Lindholm.
Chairman.
Representative Odman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to say, thank you to Mr. Miyamoto for being here and cautioning everybody about the procedures that we need to follow to make sure that consumers and producers are within the law on the front end so that there aren't any problems. This has been something that has been going on in our county up and down for quite a few years, and I've been glad to be a part of it because it's important. That's the way we get our meat. I don't want to buy foreign meat anymore. So I would just say I'm in favor of this going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on the committee have any thoughts or ideas? Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of the concept in the bill. I'm concerned that there is not currently any legislation drafted at the federal level. I think putting laws in our statutes means something, and I'm concerned about telling people, this is in our law books, but you can't follow it. And as a layperson looking at it, I'm well versed in reading the law now, thanks to 4 years being a citizen legislature, but I don't know how easy it will be for people to interpret. Now, it sounds like the department will give good warning, and there won't, it's not like some of the other bills we put forward where you're looking at prison time if you violate the law. But I just have some of those concerns about I think our ag department will do a good job if it passes federal law, but we don't even have a federal law to point to right now. So I'm only a no for that reason, committee. I support this. I want to get something done for our people. Certainly the price of food is terribly, it's burdensome on folks, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But I don't think this is the solution to fix that right now, given that we don't have a horse to ride into feds right now. So I'm hoping we can see that in the near future, and I appreciate your efforts.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Anyone else have questions or discussion about this bill? Question's been called for.
We're voting on Senate File 120. No amendments. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund is an aye. Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
No.
Representative Schmid.
Aye.
Representative Strzok.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
Aye.
8 aye, 1 no. This would pass.
Okay, thank you very much. That bill has passed the committee. Our next bill for consideration will be Senate File 80. And we have Senator Steinmetz here to present the bill. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sherry Steinmetz, Senate District 3. Good morning, committee. I'll be up for the next two, I believe, so thank you for taking these good bills up this morning. The first bill comes from your Select Water Committee. It is Senate File 80, Abandonment of Water Rights Limitations. Where this originates is we're having a lot of issues across the state with failing irrigation infrastructure, dams, diversions, et cetera. We all know about the LaPrelle and the GID tunnel collapses. And all of these things, as we repair them, affect water rights and our ability to use them. So it's not specifically designed at one project or situation, but it is designed to help us with water rights all across the state as we look at this aging irrigation infrastructure. If you go to page 1, we're in 41.3.401, failure to use water, extension of time, initiation by benefited or injured users, hearing an appeal. And basically what this does, it takes you into subsection A, where the holder of an appropriation of water from a surface, underground, or reservoir water source fails, either intentionally or unintentionally, that's important, to use the water therefrom for beneficial purposes for which it is appropriated, whether under an adjudicated or unadjudicated right during any 5 successive years. So the limitation is 5 years. If they don't run water in 5 years, then this applies. He is considered as having abandoned the water right and shall forfeit all water rights and privileges appursuant thereto, notwithstanding any provision in this section to the contrary. The holder of an appropriation for the diversion and storage of water in a reservoir from which water or a portion thereof has not been beneficially used for the purposes for which appropriated. So that doesn't automatically happen. It is not automatically abandoned, but someone else could file for abandonment on that water right if it hasn't been utilized in 5 years. So this is the new section then on page 2, lines 9 through 12. And that is, or the owner of a lawful dam or diversion system as defined in WS 41.3.307, under which appropriated water becomes unused due to necessary repairs or replacement, may apply to the Board of Control, which is in the State Engineer's Office. They're the ones that help administer water rights, for an extension not to exceed 5 years within which to use water or reactivate use of water therefrom for the beneficial purposes for which it was appropriated. So that's what we're changing. We're saying they could have a 5-year extension if this repair or replacement is going on. And that 5-year extension, if they get to the end of 5 years, they could apply again to the Board of Control. There's no limitation on that. So if it took 10 or 15 or 20 years, they could keep applying for that extension. The whole idea is the fact that this wasn't, I mean, anticipated. They're not using it because they don't want to. It's a repair situation and it's out of their control. The next change is just on page 4, where we just on line 14 add lawful dam or diversion system. And that's basically the bill. I hope I've explained it well to you, and I would stand for any questions. And I know the state engineer's office is here as well to answer your questions. They're a lot more knowledgeable than I am.
Thank you for being here. Does the committee have any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Go ahead, Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Chairman. I think my one question was, if you did have someone coming in and saying, hey, we want these, we're going to start suing, we're going to be pushing, is there some protection from the state in this? Would they jump on board? Is this going to give that protection of these people that could come in and sue?
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, Representative Strzok, sorry, I'm on your side today. I would ask the state engineer and their attorney to answer that. They would be much more qualified to answer that than I, but it is the intention of the bill that we would provide protection for that. So, but I would let them answer specifics on that, Mr. Chairman, if that's all right.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for you. At the current time with the tunnel failure or whatever down in Goshen County, is this what you're talking about here being occurring right at this time or not?
Mr. Chairman, LaPrelle has been on a restricted use. They're not up to their 5-year limit because they haven't been on restriction long enough. GID is not able to use all of their water right now. And they have been since 2019, so it would help both situations, but I don't think there are any issues as far as what they're looking at right now. No one's trying to go after their water rights, and it's just a small portion. I think their loss is between 15 and 20% right now with the ribs inside the tunnel that they can't get it's a restricted flow to the head gates below the tunnel system.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any questions? Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
So, state agencies, would they like to come forward? Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Brandon Gebhardt, State Engineer.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Chris Brown. I supervise the water section of the Attorney General's office.
Do you have any thoughts or ideas about this bill for right now?
Mr. Chairman,
ahead.
I thought Senator Steinmetz did a good job of explaining it. One thing that I would highlight is that she's absolutely correct, that there is an issue in the state of aging irrigation infrastructure and aging infrastructure across the state. Some of these larger facilities, such as dams or large diversion systems, if they fail or if they need replaced, sometimes the planning, the funding, the construction, the permitting can take a while, usually more than 5 years to accomplish that. And so what this amendment does in those instances, it provides an avenue for the water right holder to make a suggestion to the Board of Control that this is going on. And within the statute currently, there are reasonable causes for the extension. And it allows those water right holders under those reasonable causes to say, I need to extend the 5-year forfeiture of my water right. And so that's what this does. There is a provision currently in statute that if you have storage right that has not been put to beneficial use, you can use this statute to increase that 5-year period. What these changes do that's not contemplated currently in the bill is if you have one of those structures that you have been beneficially using the water from, and something happens that you're stopped your use for 5 years, this allows that reenactment. So it just ties in something that it didn't currently have, and that was had not been put to beneficial use. This contemplates, had been put to beneficial use, but needs to be paused for one of these reasons. So we would request an extension.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Gephardt? Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Chairman. So back to my question that I was asked to ask you all. So if this does happen, we have people coming, any of these groups have people coming and wanting to sue and get a lawsuit going to try to get the water rights. How is the state able to step in? What would happen with that situation?
So, Mr.
Director,
Chairman,
go ahead.
if it's all right, I might let Chris talk through the process.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Representative. So the way the statute is set up, of course, is that it's got some very specific limitations on who can bring an action for an abandonment, who can petition the Board of Control for an action in abandonment. And there are two separate statutes, and this particular bill affects either one. The main statute, the 413401, contemplates the circumstance when a junior appropriator who would be benefited by the abandonment has standing to bring that abandonment, and then they have to prove the other elements that are identified in this statute. The separate statute, and that's the change that's indicated on page 4 of the bill, is a separate mechanism whereby the state engineer could initiate an abandonment action. Okay, so we've got two separate processes. This bill would apply to both of those processes in the instance that the state engineer described, where the reason for non-use is because of the need for necessary repairs or replacement of whatever that facility is. So to answer your question, this bill directly would preclude the state engineer from bringing an action in a circumstance where the Board of Control had found that an extension was necessary because of that circumstance. Otherwise, the state's role in this process is through the Board of Control. The Board of Control, of course, is a constitutionally created agency in the state of Wyoming. It has the exclusive authority to hear these actions, and its role is as arbiter, as a quasi-judicial body in order to hear this, so the state wouldn't be a participant in that action except as the decision maker deciding whether or not the elements of the statute are met or not. So I'm not entirely sure I'm understanding your question, other than to say the state is the one that decides.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I think more of what I was thinking of, I mean, we all know of Nebraska calling for our waters. So is this going to, how does this affect us? I guess is probably what I'm wanting to know.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so under the abandonment statute, it requires, in order to have standing, that you have to be a Wyoming water right holder with junior rights that would be benefited by the abandonment. It doesn't contemplate the ability of another state. There's completely different and very complex rules with regard to how that's done. And of course, in the North Platte system, that's under the 2001 modified North Platte decree. We need to keep in mind, there are some Nebraska irrigators that have Wyoming water rights. So if they were junior and they would benefit from this abandonment, then that potential exists. What this statute, they are Wyoming water right holders, even though that water is diverted in Wyoming and then used in Nebraska. But what this statute is designed to do, that if you can show the good cause, you petition the Board of Control. The Board of Control grants that extension for the time to put that water to use. It would be protected if the Board of Control grants that from any Wyoming water right holder who could potentially have standing to bring the action.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Schmid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question of curiosity. I mean, you made mention that it could take up to 5 years to get these programs designed and funded, some of these repair and construction projects. Can a bill like this create a bigger problem with that? I mean, is it almost an excuse to take longer to get those projects funded and and designed by implementing a bill like this?
Director, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schmidt, I don't know that it provides an incentive to delay the project. It does protect the water rights. When I think about all of the things that have to occur on a very large project, the water rights are usually not part of that process. It is more of the permitting, obtaining the funding, having that funding in place before you can do certain activities, maybe design. You have to have the money in hand to do the design, then the construction. So there are multiple things that do that, but I don't see that doing this provides incentive for people to drag their feet.
Thank you. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe my one question would be, does this have any effects on our current temporary changes and use agreements and stuff like that? Would this have any whatever, could this cloud that issue any?
Just go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I think if you're thinking of the temporary water use agreement or exchanges or things like that, I don't think it interplays with that. There are specific reasonable causes identified in this that are separate, and usually those statutes, they define the protections of the underlying water right. So I don't think there's a lot of interplay. I hope Mr. Brown agrees with me.
Okay. Mr. Brown?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not thinking of any impact that this would have on existing agreements. Of course, if we had a facility, a reservoir, for example, that had some temporary water use agreements associated with it, if it's no longer able to store water, then you wouldn't be able to exercise those temporary water use agreements. So I can see how the physical circumstance might impact a temporary water use agreement, but this bill, I don't see how it would impact.
Okay, any more questions for our folks here? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Any other state agencies like to testify on this bill? Seeing none, we'll open it up to public comment. So anybody come forward that would like to testify? Mr. Moline and Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, Keith Kennedy on behalf of the Wyoming Association of Irrigation Districts, and we're fully in support of this. I think it's the last 2 points that were touched on are probably some of the most important to realize that what has changed over the last numerous decades is the time for permitting, and we don't believe requirements by other entities, federal entities especially, should impair Wyoming water rights. With that, I'd welcome any questions.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Kennedy? Seeing none, Mr. Moline, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. For all the reasons stated, I will say this has happened in the past where it was in Albany County where a dam, their head gates were leaking. They couldn't hold water, so they couldn't use it because they couldn't hold it. And it took a time to get the permits, the construction done, and they did lose, that local irrigation district did lose some water. And so this bill would have protected them. It wasn't their fault. They couldn't hold it, so they couldn't use it. You can't use what you can't hold. And to me, I think there's a difference between when you won't use it and when you can't use it. And this clarifies that if you can't use it for whatever reason, because of your infrastructure, that it's not a subject to abandonment. So sitting in firm support of this bill, Mr. Chairman, I'd take any questions you or the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Moline? Seeing none, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for being here. Appreciate your involvement. Anyone else in the public like to visit about this bill? Seeing none, what is the pleasure of the committee?
Zoom.
I guess we got, I'm sorry, we have Zoom participants.
Holly Kennedy.
You say this is,
Go ahead, Holly.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Holly Kennedy here today, testifying on behalf of the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts, here to express our support for the bill today. We do think that this is an important step forward to ensure that people's water rights are protected in those instances where they may not be able to use them for a period of time due to an infrastructure problem. I think we can all see the intent of this language when it was originally written was for those that choose not to use those water rights. And the scenario we're talking about, of course, is very different, where someone cannot use those water rights at a certain time for a physically limiting reason. And so we just wanted to stand in support of the bill today. We think it's a great step forward in protecting those rights.
thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Ms. Kennedy? Yes, Ms. Kennedy? Thank you for being here. Appreciate
Thank you,
your,
Mr. Chairman.
and so, okay, we have no one else online. We'll close public comment. What is the pleasure of the committee? Do we have a second?
Second.
Who moved it? Okay. The bill has been moved and seconded, moved by Representative Ottman and seconded by Representative Strauch. Any conversation about this bill amongst the committee members?
Question.
Okay, the question been called for. Would you conduct a vote?
We're voting on, sorry, Senate File 80 engrossed with no amendments. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund has voted aye. Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
Aye.
Representative Schmid.
Aye.
Representative Strauch.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
Aye.
Vote is 9 aye, 0 no. This bill would pass.
Okay, thank you, Mark. This bill has passed the committee 9-0. So we will now go to 84. Yeah, House Bill 84, or Senate File 84, I'm sorry. And we have Senator Steinmetz here again to explain the bill for us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sherry Steinmetz from Senate District 3. And bringing you Country of Origin Label USA Beef. This is a bill regarding food labeling and requiring country of origin labeling for beef. This bill only deals with beef, and it goes into the fair packaging and labeling provisions. When my first year in the Senate was when we passed the bill regarding fake meat is what we called it, and meat that was derived from other sources rather than actual beef or meat. And we required cell cultured or plant-based beef products not consistent with the definition of meat to be put somewhere else and labeled separately in the grocery store. So we have done this before, and it has worked for our grocers. And actually on the Senate Ag Committee, we have a grocer that is there, and he brought a lot of insight as to how this would actually work in real life in a grocery store, and how they really know where their products are coming from due to barcoding. And so he testified that it wouldn't be a huge imposition for grocers. And in fact, the smaller local grocers that we have try to do this anyway, because it is of value to them. People really want to know where their food is coming from. And so this would be a great addition, he testified. So with that, basically the bill, most of the meat of it is on page 3, just Romanet 3, beef that is derived from cattle born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States shall clearly be labeled as a product of the United States of America. For purposes of this paragraph, beef labeled as United States of America beef shall include meat processed and clearly labeled as Wyoming beef, local beef, or beef with some other specific indicator that the beef qualifies as beef of the United States. And that was the addition we put in, because some local producers already, they're selling their product at maybe a farmer's market or another way, and they have indicated, it may even just say from Goshen County or some other indicator that it is USA beef, but it doesn't have to be specifically have the USA label. They can have another indicator. We didn't want people to have to change their packaging when they're already compliant and they're already showing that they do have local beef. And then, just it has to be born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States of America. We know that many of the foreign entities and the big packers are mixing Brazilian beef or some other beef with our USA beef and labeling it USA beef. And under this act, we're trying to avoid that, because we don't believe that truly is USA beef. And we believe our producers and our consumers need to really know where our products are coming from, because more and more people want to know, like Representative Ottman testified on the Prime Act earlier. And so that's the impetus for this bill. The definition of meat is on the bottom of page 3. It's a pretty simple bill. And then on page 4, just beef means any meat from cattle, including veal. So pretty simple bill with, I think, a profound impact on our producers and our consumers. And with that, I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Seeing none, thank you very much for doing your job here. Okay, do we have any state agencies like to testify? Mr. Miyamoto, please come forward.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Doug Miyamoto with the Department of Agriculture. Again, very much appreciate what is being attempted with this legislation, understand the desire behind it. A little bit of wrinkle in the implementation is all. And so, the impact to our agency is that it would be difficult for us to implement this legislation as it's currently worded, because some of our local retailers and wholesalers can't tell us, nor can they find out, if beef coming from outside the state is born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. About 10 years ago, the World Trade Organization made a ruling that exempted beef, pork, and lamb from country of origin labeling, documentation, and reporting. So while we can control that in the slaughterhouses in which we have inspectors here in the state of Wyoming, if that meat is coming from outside and we put a mandate out there that says you have to label this, you have essentially mandatory country of origin labeling. If we send an inspector into a grocery store and say, this product should be labeled as a product of Wyoming, a local product of the United States, and our meat counter manager may say to us, I don't know that information, and when I call back up the supply chain, they don't have that data to give me. That leaves us from the Department of Ag in a situation where it becomes impossible for us to prove any guilt, so to speak. I mean, it's one of those things where if we had the information, we would say, well, you're compelled to have a label on there affixed to the product that indicates its origin. But if there isn't a label attached to it at all, and we can't verify that, we would have to assume that that product either isn't born, it isn't raised, it isn't slaughtered, or it isn't processed in the United States, and it would be impossible for us to prove any of those things had happened that way. So it's a matter of consistency for us in not really being able to prove if the claim is either true or false, if that meat is coming from outside the state of Wyoming. One of the ideas that we had at the Department of Agriculture, though, and a change that we could make, that we could enforce, could be found on page 2, starting on line 4, ending in line 6. I have copies of this if the committee's interested, and I'll run it by you first and then see if that's something of interest to you. But we had essentially just replaced the previous designation that the good senator brought up about, designating local meat, Wyoming, U.S. beef, replacing that with state of Wyoming. In the state of Wyoming, we have inspectors in all of the processing plants. Even if they're federally inspected, they do get licensure through the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, and we do have data on those carcasses. So that's something that we could prove. We could go back in the records and we could say, we can verify that this product was born in Wyoming, it was raised in Wyoming, it was slaughtered in Wyoming, and it was processed here, obviously. This is our point of control. And so if we affixed that label and limited it to the state of Wyoming, or even something local, as long as we could verify the claim, that would work for us, we could implement it. So all I'm saying here today is that if you get a counter full of meat at Walmart and it doesn't have a label affixed to it, there may not be any proof that we can garner to say whether or not they're compliant with this statute. But still, understand the premise behind it, and we would take what steps we could in order to enforce this legislation, but I think there's a lot of cases where we simply wouldn't be able to do much at the meat counter to be able to either, take product out of the meat counter that doesn't have a label affixed to it, or if it does claim that it's a product of the US and the data is not available, that would also be impossible for us to prove that they're making a false claim on the label. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might
Thank you.
have.
Questions? Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, what is the enforcement mechanism, I guess, is that in the other portions of the statute that's not listed in the bill? So say you check some of the beef, it doesn't match, what then is the process that follows?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, yeah, good question. That is one that we alluded to a little bit in the previous bill about the path of regulation that we take. Anytime that we have product that is mislabeled or misbranded, there's a series of steps that we take. Again, we try to educate first, but a lot of times if it's mislabeled or misbranded, we recall the product. And so that's a significant economic impact. If it has a misbranding or a mislabeling on it, our hands are kind of tied, and we need to get that product, recall it from sale, and then if there's an opportunity to be able to rebrand that correctly and send it back out for sale, we can sometimes do that. Depends on timing. I mean, you have issues of storage and handling that often come up with meat that sometimes make that difficult, but a lot of times we can say, here are the rules for labeling and branding. If you can get this product compliant while maintaining temperature, then you can send it back out and sell it again. If we have repeated violations, again, we consult with USDA. Ultimately, what that could end up in is, again, a suspension or revocation of a license that obviously is extremely detrimental, and we don't want to do that. The other wrinkle that I would add into that, Representative Provenza, is that before we take regulatory action, we like documented proof that we have noncompliance. That's the difficulty I have with this as it's currently worded. How do I get documented proof that the product is misbranded or mislabeled if mandatory country of origin labeling was suspended 10 years ago? It's not a requirement outside the state of Wyoming for anybody to report that information. So I may not be able to find that out. If I can't prove it. And in that case, I would be hesitant to enforce any regulations on anybody. As long as the committee understands that, I can move forward with clear eyes on this legislation.
Any more questions? Yes, Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I'm hearing you correctly, if this bill was to go in or go into law, we would be, are you saying that we would create a beef shortage in Wyoming if this bill goes into law?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I don't believe we would create a beef shortage in Wyoming. We would begin asking questions at the meat counter that the meat manager may or may not be able to answer. And if we couldn't find that documented evidence that some misbranding or mislabeling happened, we wouldn't take any action. So what I'm saying is you might have meat products that end up for sale that don't comply, but we don't have a way to find out that information to a degree that would allow me to take regulatory action against them. I guess a simpler way to put that is if we have a refrigerated section, a meat counter in a store, and it doesn't have any labels affixed to it about country of origin or region of origin, they wouldn't be regulated unless I could prove that they were born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. And in many cases, I wouldn't be able to do that.
Okay, any follow-up?
Trying to formulate it in my head.
Anyone else have questions? Yes, Representative Bodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director. So basically what this is that meat that is processed here is said product of, whether it be Wyoming, US, or whatever. And so that really, to me, would be a selling point because I would say, that's what I want. So if it isn't labeled, then I can say, I don't know where that was, so I just may not purchase that. So that's kind of what we're dealing with, right? Okay.
That's
thank you.
correct. Mr. Chairman, Representative, the core issue for us as a regulating entity and as an agency is that this state statute would require us to mandate, if those 4 conditions were met, born, raised, slaughtered, processed in the United States, then it's supposed to have a label affixed to it. In order to comply with this law, it would have to have that label on it. If it doesn't have that label on it, then technically speaking, they're non-compliant with the law. And my concern is, what do I do about that?
Okay, do you have a question now? Go ahead. Representative Davis.
Okay, so Director, Mr. Chair, Director, so basically, if I'm hearing what you just said correctly, with the federal standards, we don't really have any way of proving source or country of origin. But with this bill, we would be able to show our consumers, otherwise give them a choice that this does meet these criteria in here, and this is US beef, born and raised, and blah, blah, blah. Because you would then be able to prove that, and then the consumer would then be able to recognize that as their choice, preferred choice. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, yes, I believe that most folks that are doing local beef now affix labels as a marketing advantage. They want to advertise that that's a local product, that that's a product of Wyoming. Those things are all great. That's not my concern with this.
Okay, Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned that you might have amendment language, because it sounds like we can prove Wyoming beef, right? And if we stick to Wyoming beef, then we'll be totally fine. We'll be able to know where it was processed, where the beef came from. So I'm curious if you could, I would be interested in the language, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I do have copies of that here, so.
Senator Steinmetz, could you come forward at this time? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead, Senator.
So, Mr. Chairman, we resisted this amendment in the Senate committee, and the reason was the local grocers really do know where their product is coming from. It's the bigger box stores that may not, and they just wouldn't have to label USA beef. And people would know that that wasn't a product of USA beef if they can't prove that origin. And so testimony was that they were able to trace all of that through barcoding, and they know where their meat and their products are coming from, especially our hometown grocery stores, which this may end up giving them an advantage or at least a competitive edge on our box stores. Also, we are currently doing this with plant-based foods, and those come in from out of state as well. So the grocers are required to label that as well when it's a plant-based product, and that's been in statute, I think, since 2019. So that's being utilized right now. So in the Senate, we did resist this amendment and move the bill forward as written.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Seeing none. Do you have any comments, Director?
Mr. Chairman, no. I think that will do it. I would say maybe one comment. On the alternative protein legislation, we can prove that. So it's easier for us to go in and say, hey, you have to have this label affixed properly that lets people know that this isn't real meat. This is an alternative protein source. It's either soy or it's something else. There's a section in there about cell cultured meat, which we're dealing with as well with current legislation in this session. But those are all claims that we can either prove or disprove and do something about that. So we're comfortable with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Any other state agencies? Seeing none, we'll open it up to public comment. Mr. McGagnon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. While we certainly support what this bill is intended to do, and we believe it would be good if our producers could know, or our consumers could know where their product comes from, we do have a couple of serious concerns with the legislation. First of all, our member-developed policy says that we support voluntary country of origin labeling. And so this would not be voluntary in this case, but more important than that, by way of a bit of background, prior to this past year, any product that was processed in any manner in the U.S., even if it was just packaged in the U.S., under USDA regulations, could be and was labeled as product of the USA. That was frankly very deceptive to the consumers because it may have only had a very final step taken in USA. We've worked successfully to get USDA to change that in the past year so that now product of the USA at the federal level is a voluntary label that is available to be utilized, but only if you have clear evidence that it was born, raised, and processed. It's been redefined to be born, raised, and processed, but it's voluntary. So at least the deceptiveness of what we saw in the old label has now been removed. The concern that we have with this approach is it's really putting all the burden on the domestic product. If this legislation said any beef that is not born, raised, and processed in the US must be labeled. Then it puts the burden on importers, but this puts the burden on US production. And what we're fearful of, certainly it works fine for small operations processing beef in Wyoming or something, but that's only a small percentage of the product we utilize here. A major processor or retail or wholesaler that's bringing beef into Wyoming could very well look at this and say, well, I don't want to accept the risk that I'm going to ship some beef to Wyoming that it may be born, raised, and processed in the US, but I can't guarantee it, so I don't want to put a label on it because I would be putting myself at risk if I put the label on. So the easiest way out for me as a major processor is to make sure that any beef I ship to Wyoming was in fact imported. That way I know I'm not at any risk of having violated this law, and that's the concern that we have, that because if they can't prove that it was born, raised, and processed, which under current system in most cases they can't, they're taking a risk by shipping it to Wyoming. But if they know that it's some beef they imported, they can ship it to Wyoming, put no label on it, and they haven't violated our state law. So that's where we're nervous with going forward with this the way it's proposed today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. McGagnon? Yes, not. Thank you. Yes, Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGagna, if we amended the bill to that we got from Department of Ag in terms of state of Wyoming beef, what would your thoughts be on the bill at that point?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Provenza, I'm not sure, I thought they had handed me their amendment, but instead I got a copy of the original bill, so I'm not sure I know what their amendment says.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, essentially, what it looks like the amendment does is it removes the requirement for labeling as United States beef and instead makes it about state of Wyoming. Meaning that we would know that the beef was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed all in Wyoming instead of USA beef.
No, now I have that amendment in front of me. Beef is born, raised. We'd be very supportive of that because we feel that something can realistically be accomplished in Wyoming. The processors we have in Wyoming, for the most part, are here because they're utilizing Wyoming beef, and they're purchasing direct from people who are raising that beef who can verify that where the animal was born, where it was raised, or it's processed. So we think that's would be a very good step because it would help to foster more true use of local product. And anything we can do to foster the sale of Wyoming beef in Wyoming is positive in our view.
Okay, Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just kind of questioning why we can't prove where this beef is coming from if, you know, in the state of Wyoming, we have all our identification that follows that animal to the slaughter process, right? I mean, we have brand inspection, we have our Bruce, you know, all our tags, tattoos, everything, you know, that sources that carcass from somewhere. Wouldn't it just seems simple enough to me that the person at the slaughter plant, that would be easy to prove that animal was, just follow the brand back, or, you know, like we currently do for health reasons. So I guess I'm a little confused on what's in this process. What's so hard about identifying where the carcass came from? Am I missing something?
Yes, Mr. McGagnon.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I think that, I wish it were that way, but for example, brands mean something to us here. You go east of the Missouri River in Nebraska, brands are meaningless anymore. That's not a tool. Some of the tags we use here because of our brucellosis, they are. Perhaps it would be assisted if we were using electronic ID, which is something we've been opposed to. So we lose that as a potential tool. But for a large processor that's processing 5,000 head a day, all that meat goes together for the most part. And I mean, to trace first of all, they purchase it from a feedlot, and feedlot may not even know whether those cattle had spent some time on some pasture in Canada before they were finished someplace else and brought to the feedlot. And then the processor is lumping all that product together, and they simply do not track so that they can say where a particular package of meat came from what animal. The complexities of the system simply don't allow that today. If it's something we could get to in a practical way, certainly it would be wonderful, but.
Okay, any more, yes, Representative Strong.
Thank you, Chairman. I think, how do we stop the big processors that mix the foreign beef with our American beef or our local beef? Is there a way in your mind that we can do this? I think this is where really what we were trying to stop here. So is there another way that we can make this work?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stock, or one of the thoughts that I kind of threw out is that I think it could work more easily if what we were requiring is that the labeling of foreign product, because that's a very small percentage of our production in the US, and it's more easily tracked. A lot of it goes into ground product, and that's another concern we have with this bill. It says if it's US born, raised, processed beef, it has to be labeled. Or if I have hamburger that I mixed US born, raised, and processed meat with imported meat, do I violate this if I don't label that? Or because it contains this product? It's very confusing to us, and we would love to get to that system, but I think the focus should be at this point on requiring the labeling of the imported product, because it's a small percentage of our overall, and rather than the labeling of all the US production.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Magagna? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And go ahead with introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jonathan Downing, appearing on behalf of Wyoming Petroleum Marketers Association. Our executive directors online for some remote testimony, as well as a few other folks that are impacted by this legislation. I'm here for technical assistance on any of the amendments or other things as those move forward. I will say that I think most people would definitely want to be supportive of knowing where their produce comes from, where their beef comes from. And it's the pieces that are in the details are mainly at what point in the supply chain do you ensure that that happens as far as it being 100% American beef. And with that, I'll be around for questions if you have anything. Otherwise, they're available on Zoom.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Downing? Thank you very much. Is there any other public comment? Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I'm just on the consumer end of this, but I read labels, and I will prefer to buy Wyoming product first and US product second. And I'm a little bit troubled by hearing some of the testimony that says these large producers mix beef, and so you don't know what you're getting. At any rate, when there's no label on it, I usually will go over it and buy something else. So I think this is a good bill. Maybe there's some details to work out. You heard from Mr. Magagna. Nevertheless, I support the bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Winnie? Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Era Arano, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. We support country of origin labeling and are working on that with our national group. And we think that may be where this lies. We do love the intent, but we think maybe the amendment provided by the department is the way to go in terms of what we can control. And we will continue to fight at the national level for country of origin labeling.
Thank you. Any questions for testifier? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. Labeling works. And the local grocery store in the town where I live bought some animals through the junior livestock sale at the county fair. And by putting up a sign that this was so-and-so's animal, it sold quickly. It was good advertising for the youth and for the store. But in discussions with people that work in the meat packing industry, the indications were they know where these animals come from. Because of the health concerns, they have to trace them backwards. They know where these animals come from. The one type of meat that they wouldn't be able to say with as much certainty would be hamburger. That's the one they put a lot of the animals together and grind it. But on your roast, your T-bones, when those come from the primal, they know. They keep track of that because of the health concerns that they have to keep track of. If there's a disease outbreak, they have to know where those animals go. So the packers, at least the ones that I've talked to that were not up at the high corporate level, they know where these animals come from. They know the lineage of them, where they've been. They have to know, and they are quite able to verify. That's the indication I got. So sitting in support of this bill, I would take any questions you or the committee may have, sir.
Any questions for Mr. Moline? Representative Schmidt.
Mr. Moline, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moline, have you seen Mr. Miyamoto's amendment?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, no, but I've, hearing the discussion on it today, it would be another form of, the made in Wyoming rather than made in USA is the way I interpret that. It's going to limit the supply. If it has to be all contained in the state of Wyoming, it's still going to be a positive marketing tool, and there's going to be people that are going to target it. But to me, it would add another label. You'd have the made in Wyoming and the made in USA. And at this point, I'd rather stay with the made in USA, but I would appreciate if that amendment goes on there than the made in Wyoming. That's going to be a target, especially to some of our out-of-state visitors. They want to eat Wyoming beef.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions for Mr. Moline? See none, thank you very much for being here. Welcome. State your name and who you represent.
Thank you. I'm Amy Law, and I represent a small farm here in Wyoming. We raise grass-fed and finished organic beef. Well, it's not organically certified, but I am in support of noting the origin, and especially Wyoming. That would be fantastic. The money would stay here. We work hard, and we're still on the free meals at school because we can barely make it. So I am in this support of this. The one thing I would mention is that we live in the north in Cody, so excuse me, we process our meat in Billings. And so if you said born, raised, but if you did processed in Wyoming too, that would cut us out. So I might just make that in the amendment, but it would be fantastic if it said country of origin and also state from Wyoming. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you. Any more public comment? Guess we have some folks on Zoom, so.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have 3 people on Zoom, and the first one to speak is.
Which one? Yeah, welcome, ma'am. Go ahead, can you take your unmute your machine and go ahead.
Good morning. I think I heard that it's my turn to testify, and I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman Winter. My name is Sarah Pettit, and I work for Associated Food Stores. We are a wholesaler and distributor for over 450 independent local retailers across 9 Western states. 40 of those retailers are located in the great state of Wyoming. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to discuss this topic with you. I want to start by noting the massive amount of respect that Associated Food Stores has for our U.S. cattle ranchers. As a wholesaler for independent grocers, we understand the importance of local, and we support local first whenever we possibly can. I also want to talk about some of the challenges that we would face if SF 84 were passed as it's currently written. As a wholesaler, I've had the opportunity to talk about the complications of this bill with my warehouse facility as well as my meat buying team. As we know, it would be incredibly difficult for our teams to properly segregate beef within our warehouse because we know that they could have 2 or even potentially 3 labels. So ensuring that we were getting the right meat to the state of Wyoming would unintentionally raise beef costs to make accommodations to follow this law. As it sits, the beef market is incredibly tight, and the last thing that we want to do is raise the cost of food for Wyoming residents. Furthermore, we know that Senator Lummis is sponsoring a similar federal bill aimed at packers, and we support this approach as segregation within our warehouse at the state level at that point would not be a problem, and we trust her to get that job done and absolutely want to support that local initiative. In addition, we do know that local marketing does work and labeling local meat does work. Our local stores will always do that and currently do that now in order to showcase when a product is local. We fully support local ranchers and would love to collaborate on the best way to support local in a way that does not impact warehousing and beef pricing for the communities that we serve. So I'd stop and ask for any questions, and thank you for the hearing today.
Yes, thank you for being here. Any questions for Ms. Pettit? Yes, Representative Strzok.
Thank you, Chairman. I think just all the questions I would come up in my head was how, you go grocery store and the apples. I mean, they're New Zealand, they're, California. I mean, they're everywhere. They've said where they're coming from. I'm just wondering why it seems to be that we're making it complicated that we can't do that for the meat also. I guess what's the difference in this scenario?
Yes, Ms. Pettit.
Thank you for the question. In talking with my warehouse facility, they said that there are already segregated places for our produce. This would just change the process. It would make the beef side less efficient. And therefore, we would need to find additional ways to segregate that beef. And in doing so, the process is changed. Therefore, it does have cost impacts.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Provenza?
Thank you. With that question, so with the burden placed on the processing facilities, Wyoming has a small population. I guess one of my questions would be then what's the tipping point of we are going to send less or no beef? Just what's the thought process in that in terms of if we add this added regulation, are we going to see potentially any decrease in the amount of meat that the state of Wyoming is delivered?
Ms. Pettit?
In talking with my meat buyer, he was concerned about segregating and then, of course, keeping the beef supply fluid in the state of Wyoming.
Okay. Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pettit, in your grocery facilities, do the meat departments still process the meat and package it?
Yes, there are a variety of ways that they do that. At times, of course, things are prepackaged. And then, of course, we're also bringing in carcasses that those that have butcher blocks are processing and labeling in-house. So you do see a bit of both, if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for Ms. Pettit? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Is Mr. and Mrs. Greer online?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name's Gary Bailey. I serve as the Executive Director of Wyoming Petroleum Marketers Convenience Store Association. More of a technical person, and so relative to the bill under subsection E, when it says that the department shall promulgate rules with respect to labeling on every retailer and every wholesaler, I guess my point, and as I've learned more about this in the last couple months, and I also wanted to publicly apologize to the senator for not bringing these concerns forward transparently in the committee. It's completely on me as the association director, and so I wanted to publicly state that. I think that it's burdensome and maybe could use some revision that you're asking retailers to certify a process they have no control over. And so if it's on the processor, and whether that processor is existing in Wyoming or in a state like Montana or Nebraska, and they are willing to segregate out the cattle and, say that cattle that are produced and that the ranchers or the stockmen sell those processors are Wyoming, then I think that makes more sense than putting on a retailer to certify something they have no real control over. I do think that if the entire distribution chain, from the rancher to the processor to the meat packer to the grocer, is all contained in Wyoming, then it could absolutely work. I guess I'm questioning, though, why you guys would need a law to do that. I think that the folks that are on my board and the folks that I represent would be more than happy just to do that, as everybody stated, as a market advantage, as supporting local neighbors. I guess I don't know why we would need a regulation to do that. So for me, what this seems to be trying to control is people outside of the state of Wyoming who bring product into the state. And I'm not sure, based on the comments from the department, how they could control a processing plant in a state, in a facility that doesn't exist within Wyoming. So I actually think that there's a path forward where we can incentivize and we can support Wyoming ranchers, Wyoming processors through our retail channels. I just don't think that it's responsible to put a burden of a certification on a retailer or wholesaler when they're not controlling the processing system in plants outside of Wyoming. So thank you so much. Again, I wanted to apologize publicly to the senator, but thank you for the time this morning, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for being here. Any questions for Mr. Bailey? Yes, Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I missed who you're representing. Could you restate that?
Yeah, no. So I'm actually the director of Wyoming Petroleum Marketers and Wyoming Convenience Store Association. And the last couple of years, I had a friend named Mary Lou Chapman who ran the Rocky Mountain food industry for a long time, and she retired. And so I've been trying desperately to cover kind of for the smaller grocers in Wyoming. And my subject matter isn't the same as it is in the other things that kind of our scope. So it's in part the reason why it kind of took us so long to weigh in. But we have probably 30 small grocer members as folks that, we've kind of absorbed from the Rocky Mountain food industry.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for Mr. Bailey? Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir.
Any more public comment?
Nancy, Nancy McCann on Zoom.
Okay. Ms. McCann, go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. My name is Nancy McCann, and I represent the Powder River Basin Resource Council. As I mentioned on one of the earlier bills, our membership is over 1,500 folks within Wyoming, which includes ranchers and producers and others. We are rising in support of this bill. And we believe that the reason Wyoming needs to head this way is that we want certainty for the appropriate labeling, whether it says USA beef and also Wyoming beef. We do support Senate File 84, and I stand for any questions.
Any question for Ms. McCann? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Is there any other public comment? Senator Steinmetz, do you have any comments on what's transpired here?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll just try to sweep away some of the black helicopters we've heard. So, as luck would have it, my kids own a USDA processing plant. So to say that none of this is being regulated is not completely accurate, because there are very high standards that the USDA has through the processing plants and tracking of every single individual animal that comes in, that has to have documented paperwork, where it's from, what's, where it came from. And it has to have a tracking number all the way through the USDA process. And then when it comes out the other side as processed, cut into steaks or your roasts or hamburger, which they don't grind anything together. It's your animal and your hamburger that comes out. Then they put on the barcode. And so there's barcodes on every single package of that beef. So you know exactly where it came from, and that barcoding system is in place. So people have a way to track that. They have to be able to do that for disease traceability, or if there were a recall on those labels or anything like that. And as I said before, our good senator, who's a grocer over on the other side, verified that as well, how that meat comes to them, and he knows. What we're hearing today is there are a lot of people that are importing beef that is either being mixed with our USA beef, or it isn't USA beef, and they don't really want people to know that. But we have ways to know that through the USDA processing plants, and those rules aren't different for USDA plants in other areas. In fact, that's exactly what the Prime Act is about, because we can't ship just our local processing plants, our Wyoming plants. We can't ship that across state lines. Why? Because the USDA system does have a traceability and trackability system that they implement on all of their plants all across the United States. So to say that we can't figure this out, I don't understand that argument at all whatsoever. I mean, I've been in my little gown and cut the meat up and slapped the label with the barcode on it. So I know it happens. I've seen it. And our USDA inspectors are there. And when you take the head off, they look at all the organs and the liver and all of that. And that's standardized across the entire supply chain in the United States. So that's not but we are importing a lot of beef from Brazil. It's coming in on the, hanging on the rack frozen, and people are cutting that up. And, that's a different quality. It's a different way of supplying a product. All we're saying here is if it's born, raised, and slaughtered in the USA, our consumers have a right to know that. We have a traceability system in place through our USDA processors, and our grocers have a barcode system that they can know that, whether they want to disclose it or not. you know, that's the thing here. And I think that they should be disclosing it and they should be telling consumers where their product is coming from.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Senator Steinmetz? Representative Ottman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, just one question. Born, raised, slaughtered, and then we had the processed. And the lady back there was saying, because I know in our area, we had a processing place, but now it's being run by an individual more than helping the other producers in the community. So they're having to come to Sheridan or maybe over to Billings. How can that, I mean, it's born and it's raised and everything in Wyoming, but if they cross that line over into Montana, is there, how would that be handled, or how could they market it? Do you have any?
Senator?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman, that's why it's USA beef. The amendment from the Department of Agriculture seeks to take it to Wyoming, but that's why we wanted to keep it USA, because then it would cover, you know, there are folks from our area that have some processed in Colorado as well, Mr. Chairman and Representative, but if we just put a Wyoming label and somebody that's closer to the Colorado line goes to Colorado and has that beef processed, then it wouldn't qualify. So that's the issue with the USA label.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you,
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Chairman.
Okay, what's the will of the committee?
Move the bill.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we move the bill forward. Do you have the motion and second? Okay. Is any discussion from the committee? Yes, Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm gonna, give me some grace, I'd like to talk about my amendment before I move it, because I don't know that I'll get a second on it. I think it sounds like there might be some complications and unintended consequences if we do USA labeled beef. I support that. I came here excited to vote for the bill, but I think in the implementation, we might have some struggles. I do like the idea of having pro-Wyoming beef labeled and having Wyoming beef labeled. I think that supports our Wyoming industry more so than anyone else, and I think it really gives them a leg up, particularly if you don't have the US label on it. So I think to label our beef with made and processed, slaughtered, everything in Wyoming would really benefit our Wyoming producers. And that's, I think, part of the intent of this bill, is more than just supporting USA beef, but how can we also support Wyoming? And that's where my heart is, Mr. Chairman. So I would like to move the amendment that was brought by, the Ag Department, Ag Agency, that says that beef that is derived from cattle born, raised, slaughtered in the state of Wyoming at a state licensed meat establishment, not applicable for retailers or wholesalers. And I can give all that language to LSO. What I'm taking out is the word processed, because from the testimony, I would like to be able, we don't have enough facilities. I think it would be important to make sure that people in Wyoming, that their cattle's born, raised, and slaughtered here are able to sell their meat and get a label that says born, slaughtered, raised in Wyoming. So that is my amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I hope I can get a second.
Do we have a second to this motion? It's been moved and seconded, moved by Representative Provenza and seconded by Representative Schmid. Yes, Representative Strauch.
Thank you, Chairman. We also had testimony that if we leave it just Wyoming, we are going to hurt other producers and going to hurt other aspects of this also. That's why we're leaving it with open to the US.
Yes, Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to comment on this, on page 3, section I, down there on lines 7, 8, and 9, it does say, well, let me see. Beef that is derived from cattle born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States shall clearly be labeled as a product of the United States of America For purposes of this paragraph, beef labeled as United States of America beef shall include meat processed and clearly labeled as Wyoming beef, local beef, or beef with some other specific indicator. So it doesn't discriminate against putting that as well. Or I don't see that.
Representative Provenza?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that that's fair. It would potentially have both labels, but I think it really highlights the difference between Wyoming's beef and others. And to the point of not wanting to discriminate against other producers outside of Wyoming. I mean, I represent Wyoming and my investment is in the people of Wyoming, and that maybe it gives us a leg up over another state, but I think that should be the intention.
Okay. Yes, Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only problem with removing processed, the beef is usually slaughtered at the plant, not just processed. So you deliver that animal to the plant, which is on the other side of the border, which would be, it creates a lot of issues there. You know, because being a border community, we run into this constantly, okay? But you have to take a live animal in. So for that reason, I'm against your amendment there. But I am in favor of this bill because I think we don't want to mix up too many things here. But, you know, we can still have that with Wyoming involved here because there are 7 state inspected federal processing plants that can market that Wyoming beef in Wyoming and put that extra label on there. But I think what the bill is, the intent of this bill is to get US beef to the consumers in Wyoming. So in that aspect, I understand there's some issues with the food chain getting it here. But in the issues of safety, we know where this beef is coming from. You know, when they process that, no different than if they process your beef, we know where that beef came from, other than possibly the hamburger. So I'm in favor of the bill as it sits. And I think the Wyoming labeling can already occur with the 7 USDA plants that we have currently in the state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Representative Provenza? You have any comments?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think vote your conscience. I will say, what I would like to do, well, I'll leave this for after the amendment because it's separate.
Okay. So this can be a voice vote. All in favor of the amendment by Representative Provenza, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay, the amendment has failed. Yes, Representative Provenza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not an amendment at this time because I don't know exactly how to word it, but I think if part of the intent is to make sure we're also labeling Wyoming beef, I think we could clean up that subparagraph 3 and maybe make it 2. So you have ruminant 3 talks about the USA beef, and then we would add ruminant 4, which would say, and for beef in Wyoming, here's the process for that. I just think it would clarify the language, clean it up a little bit. It would be the same bill, but I don't have language for that right now. So I would, maybe I'll talk with the sponsor and see if she's amenable to it and bring it for committee of the whole.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, as a good representative is talking about there, but we like to usually keep our bills to single subject. I've been told on the floor. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Senator Steinmetz?
Mr. Chairman, if I could address that, and Representative Provenza, I appreciate your sentiment. The reason that's in there and worded the way that it is because I was contacted by producers, and many of them have specific labels. So, for example, in my daughter and son-in-law's plant, they'll do the graphic design and send it to them in a PDF, and then they print it out and put it on their beef. And that is designed to not affect their label that they've spent the money on a graphic design and everything for. So we're not being very prescriptive there because we don't want them to have to spend another, 20 grand on a roll of labels or packages or whatever they're utilizing. So we wanted to make that very fluid for them to be able to continue to utilize their packaging that they're currently using, which identifies, possibly the town it comes from or the county in Wyoming or something like that. So that's why that language is in there the way it is.
Okay. Any more questions or discussion?
Question on the bill.
Okay, the question's been called for. We have a second?
You don't have to have a second.
I don't. Oh, well, let's get one anyway.
Not on that one.
Okay. Do you have a roll call?
Clarification. The amendment that Mr. Miyamoto brought forward is out, correct? Correct. Okay. We are voting on Senate File 84 with no amendments, correct? Correct. Okay. Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Representative Eklund has voted aye.
Excuse.
Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Ottman.
Aye.
Representative Provenza.
Nope.
Representative Schmid.
Aye.
Representative Strock.
Aye.
Chairman Winter.
Aye.
The vote is 8 aye, 1 no. This bill would pass.
Okay. I guess our meeting is adjourned.